What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 202. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone, covering Afghanistan, Russia, and China on today's show. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. Share the show from there. You find the links to everything everywhere you can subscribe to the show, and the Patreon, the Subscribe Star, the crypto information if you want to donate that way. But definitely check out the Institute and also the daily news roundup that I put out there, libertarianinstitute.org/Kyle for a full archive of my work. And then you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code for the show is PEACE, PEACE. That'll save you 25% off and get the show a kit back. Fantastic selection of products at Paloma Verde. They combine their soft gels with like melatonin and curcumin. They make an excellent sports cream that's great for relieving muscle pain and smells like, has a great menthol smell. But whatever you have going on, there's probably something that can help you at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code PEACE. All right, let's get into the show. The first thing I want to cover today is Afghanistan, where we have an announcement from the Pentagon that no U.S. troops involved in the August drone strike that killed 10 civilians in Kabul, including 7 children, will face disciplinary action. And this is, hugely disappointing, but completely expected as well. On the show, we've covered this strike since August and broken it down. How the U.S. absolutely could have known that they were carrying out a strike against a man who worked for a California-based aid company, that he had gone to his boss's home, that he was, picking up a laptop for his boss, that he was filling his car with tanks of water because, you didn't have running water in houses in Kabul, and how all this was absolutely predictable. But the absolute worst part, the biggest thing that absolutely makes it a crime, is even the Pentagon admits that there were children on the drone strike feed before they carried out the strike, but nonetheless, in a investigation that's already been completed by Air Force Lieutenant General Sammy said, and again, we covered all this, they already said that nobody would face any criminal review and that it was a tragic mistake not caused by misconduct or negligence. And, maybe there were a couple things that people could have done better. There was a breakdown in communication, and, maybe they could have done a better job trying to identify the target. But overall, this is the U.S. drone strike program. Now, this should have, with the Sammy said, findings, provoked a massive debate in the United States that, wait, you're telling me that 7 children ended up dead, and the person you were targeting, that the person that you thought was a terrorist, was actually a person who worked for a U.S. based international aid company, and this is in the city of Kabul that the U.S. has occupied for 20 years. This has to be even so, if nobody did anything wrong by the rules in August, certainly the rules need a major overhaul and there should be major outrage, but there's none of that at all. And so, I would imagine to really have some kind of major change, it would have required Sammy Said's investigation, or somebody to, have the courage to actually bring up war crimes. And, I'm not saying that you had to throw the drone pilot who hit the button in jail for, but, everybody who authorized this strike, and, especially the higher ups. Look at CENTCOM General Kenneth McKenzie, who's, we now know has been running an operation in CENTCOM that has been racking up dead civilians all over the Middle East through its drone program and airstrikes. And these people have to be held accountable, and if they're never held accountable, then it's just going to keep continuing. But that nobody will even be disciplined, lose some rank, or anything like that, guarantees that there's no reason for any soldier or anybody within the military to have to think twice about carrying out a drone strike, because, no matter how horrific it ends up, even when, you get detailed reporting about this strike in the New York Times showing how it could have very easily been prevented, if even in that case nobody is held accountable, then nobody's ever going to be held accountable for something like this. All right, so looking back at Afghanistan, of course, the U.S. war there was horrible, but the situation the U.S. has created with withdrawing and freezing all the funds and essentially causing the biggest bubble popping, at least proportionally, for a country maybe ever. And I mean, you might have to go back to like post World War II or something like that, where you've had like a foreign countries creating an economic crisis in a country worse than what's happening right now in Afghanistan. From Dade to Camp and antiwar.com, in the wake of the withdrawal, Afghanistan is facing dire humanitarian crises, which is being exacerbated by U.S. economic pressure. Citing the UN World Food Program, New York Times reported that about 22.8 million Afghans, more than half the country's population, are expected to face life-threatening hunger this winter, and 8.7 million Afghans are nearing famine. So once you hit famine conditions, is definitely once you have particularly old people, but also children under 5 really start dropping dead from the famine conditions. Now, there is $10 billion in an account that's in the name of the Afghan government. The complicated thing is pre-August 15th, the Afghan government was backed by the United States, and starting September in Afghanistan, the government is now the Taliban, which the U.S. has sanctioned. And so that $10 million, or really anything, can't go to Afghanistan because the Afghan government is sanctioned. Now, there have been ways to trickle aid in and everything like that. China has given some aid. Pakistan has given some aid. There's been a lot of people fleeing into Iran and they receive aid there and everything like that. But generally, aid cannot get into Afghanistan. Covered in the past how even these international organizations have said that the comfort letters provided by the U.S. governments to the companies needed to facilitate these transactions, the banks, the financial institutions, the shipping companies, and all that, don't feel like the comfort letters are enough to guarantee that you won't run afoul of U.S. sanctions, and so they refuse to participate because U.S. sanctions are a death blow to a lot of companies, and major hits to what they're able to do. Also, if you have any assets in the United States of America, the U.S. government will seize those. So being hit by sanctions are just such a major impact that so many companies are just not willing to risk running afoul of U.S. sanctions. And so if U.S. sanctions remain on Afghanistan, only aid is only going to trickle in insofar as the U.S. approves it. And so I believe I already covered this on the show, but the World Bank did approve I believe $280 billion of frozen funds to go to Afghanistan. It's not nearly enough. It will blunt the coming crisis a little bit, of course. I think 180 million is going to UNICEF and $100 million is going to the World Food Program. Hopefully that money actually ends up in the hands of the or money or food ends up in the hands of the Afghan people that need it. But until sanctions are lifted and normal commerce can resume with Afghanistan, then it's going to be dependent on the aid that trickles in, and not able as a country that's going to be able to start to rebuild itself. Of course, these kind of circumstances, abject poverty, are going to I'm sure lead to a rise in violence and more militias and stuff like this. This tends to happen around the world. When people start to like literally see their children starve to death, they get really, really desperate and are willing to do anything to prevent that from happening. And so these are the kinds of conditions that the U.S. is creating in Afghanistan with its sanctions. Now, there is a way we could lift the sanctions tomorrow and aid could pour in and trade could resume, and it probably isn't going to prevent every child from starving to death in Afghanistan this winter, but it could definitely save a lot of lives. And I'm not really willing to say like how bad I think it's going to be in terms of numbers. I think that thing is really hard to predict. But when you have millions of people in famine conditions, it's important to understand that means there are likely hundreds of thousands of children in the most vulnerable category under 5 and elderly people that are at risk of dying here. And while there may be some aid able to get to them, maybe some bare minimum food situations that are able to occur to prevent it from being, a full on calamity for those hundreds of thousands and them all dropping dead, it likely means that, at least some of them will be starving to death because of what the U.S. is doing there. And as time moves on, we'll get a more clear picture, and I'll talk more about how bad it is. But it looks to be pretty bad this coming winter in Afghanistan. Very, very concerning. And this is even coming more and more from the international human rights community. This published in The Guardian. Afghan health system is close to collapse due to sanctions on Taliban. And, these are the Western agencies publishing in, very U.S. government friendly newspapers that look, this is going to be disgusting what's going to happen in Afghanistan. And, we're now looking at a situation where it's not even just starvation that's going to be killing people, but if there's a collapse with the healthcare system and there's, people are eating bad food, drinking questionable water, then people are going to start succumbing from easily preventable illnesses and diseases as well, and really exacerbate what's happening in Afghanistan. And again, without the U.S. sanctions, this wouldn't be happening. All right, a couple other things go on related to Afghanistan. The State Department and the Pentagon are conducting reviews into the withdrawal period of Afghanistan. I think the State Department one reaches back about 2 years from the withdrawal, or like from September 2021, say, and then the Defense Department one slightly shorter, and it only goes back to the actual signing of the agreement in February of 2020. I don't really expect this to generate any real new information, but that being said, we've had like the Afghan papers and stuff like that come out, and depending on how much maybe the Inspector General, a special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko's office is involved, particularly in the Pentagon one. Maybe there is a chance that there could be some real lessons learned type information coming out here, and actual things that could cause maybe actual policy evaluations and not just empty words. But I kind of suspect it will be empty words. Move Alabama has an article out discussing some recent reporting from around the U.S. withdrawal in Kabul, particularly the suicide bombing that happened outside of the Albany Gate on August 26th. I think 160 plus people is the generally accepted count now of the number of people that have died. And Move Alabama points out that there's new evidence emerging that, yes, some people likely were killed by the CIA trained death squads. These are the 01, 02 death squads, and we've talked about the war crimes of these squads in the past on the show, but Move Alabama is pointing out that they were definitely there, and that there's, decent evidence that there was some bullet wounds happening. Now, again, I've been skeptical from the start that this was the case. I guess in trying to figure out what happened, I've said it's been very difficult, and especially that this occurred near a drainage ditch, and even point out in this Move Alabama article, some people may have drowned or something like that, or been trampled to death, that kind of thing. But he does point out, and makes a good point here with the number of people dead, and with some of the evidence now coming out, it does seem that somebody likely fired, and the U.S. has obscured who that was, whether it was our forces, Marines, or something like that, or the CIA trained forces. And if it was the CIA trained forces, these people, I believe, largely were brought out of Afghanistan and probably coming to the U.S. So that's not good or comforting news. The U.S. or the State Department says that it has relocated 900 Americans or permanent residents of the United States from Afghanistan since the withdrawal on August 31st. I'm not sure exactly how they define this, like if somebody made it to Pakistan and then the State Department bought them a ticket and probably charged them afterwards from Karachi and got them to Qatar or the United States or something like that, or if this is actually a case where they maybe talked with the Taliban to help facilitate this, chartered some planes, but they claim 900 and that there's only fewer than a dozen U.S. citizens in Afghanistan who are still there who currently want to leave. The U.S. government will begin denying Afghans who are seeking the ability to come to the United States through the humane parole process. Usually, they only accept 2,000 people through this process a year, or they only take 2,000 applicants through this process a year. And now there's 30,000 Afghans applying. So it seems that there will likely be a lot of Afghans who are rejected from that process coming up very quickly. All right, now let's move on and talk about Russia. And from the last time we talked about Russia on the show, there has been some seeming positive developments from the U.S. side, maybe looking to de-escalate. But we had the talks between Biden and Putin, and we have, threats exchanged on each side. But as, we've been talking about for a couple weeks on the show, it has been interesting that the U.S. Threats against Russia have been relatively limited to what you would expect. They're saying that if you invade Ukraine, we're going to sanction you, which is something that anybody who listens to this show already knows that it was 100% likely to happen. And so, of course, the Russians, of course, knew that too. And it was just very interesting that that was the threat that the United States was making. And maybe that's because it is like a policy from the top from Joe Biden. We learned this week that Biden said that the U.S. sending troops to Ukraine was not on the table. Now, I believe he did put in a qualifying word there, unilateral. So it is possible that what he's actually, maybe trying to wink and nudge say is that, boy, if our Polish, or not all of our NATO partners, but the Poles or the Latvians or the Lithuanians, if they're willing to go along with us in trying to defend Ukraine from Russia, and then we're willing to do it. I'm not sure which it is, but it does seem that Biden is maybe saying that, look, there's really not a military solution for the United States in Ukraine, which is hopefully what he is saying. But at the same time, he did give himself some wiggle room in that statement. Also had this report from the Associated Press. Dave DeCamp reports at antiwar.com, an unnamed source from the Associated Press, that senior U.S. State Department officials told Ukraine that a NATO membership is unlikely to be approved within the next decade, a sign the U.S. is not willing to further escalate tensions with Russia over Ukraine. This, if true, which, the Biden administration didn't deny, so my guess is that it is true, it is somewhat significant that, we're not going to give Ukraine a formal membership at least for 10 years. And it could be the kind of thing that the Biden administration would believe would be enough to kind of quell U.S. tensions with Russia. Now, again, this is, I think, kind of also an sneaky move, or it could be at least, right? The U.S. has had Ukraine on a membership plan of action, I think, since the Bush administration, so well over 10 years now. So, saying they're going to stay on that process for another 10 years may not seem like a good move to Russia because of what the United States has done in Ukraine during that period of time, carrying out coups and trying to take the base at Sevastopol and make it a NATO base. Really, the 2014 coup was in some ways a regime change effort where they're, banning the Russian language, or not banning, but making it not an official language in Ukraine, and all this kind of stuff. Also, that, as Ted Galen Carpenter points out, in some ways, Ukraine almost seems like a de facto NATO member, despite the fact that, Biden says the U.S. isn't going to put troops in Ukraine. We keep having high-ranking U.S. officials, including Biden, saying that we're committed to defending Ukraine's territorial integrity and their sovereignty, which sounds an awful lot like, if you're committed to defending someone's territorial sovereignty. I mean, there's a couple words in there that could be obscured, but it sounds an awful lot like you're saying that if somebody invades, you're going to go to war, to defend that territorial integrity and stuff like that. I'm not sure. I guess I find the Biden administration is giving itself a lot of wiggle room, but at the same time, they are making statements that do sound like coming down and backing out from the height of a couple weeks ago, where it seemed like they were really threatening it and maybe potentially willing to say, yeah, we'll go to war with Russia over Ukraine. Now, I think Russia kind of is looking at this and maybe a similar perspective, where they really don't trust what the U.S. is saying, and saying we're only going to put on sanctions, saying that we're not going to allow Ukrainian membership for a few years is probably nice, but not enough. Russia is putting forward security proposals to the U.S. and is asking the United States to rescind the promise of future membership in NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. It is worth noting that there was a big NATO summit pretty recently, and there not only was Ukraine and Georgia asking for NATO membership, but also Moldova, which probably is less significant in some respects, but at the same time would be further NATO expansion, I'm sure, seen as provocative by NATO, also adding almost nothing to the United States security to add a country like Moldova to NATO. All right. So that's that's the kind of, some of the points I wanted to make. Russia, I don't know what was in their security proposal. I'm guessing that's directed around the non-NATO expansion issue and not moving any new weapons into Eastern Europe. There is some statements by Russia saying that they're concerned that the U.S. and NATO might deploy weapons that were previously banned by the INF Treaty. That's the intermediate range nuclear forces. These are the missiles that with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers, and they were banned, and then Trump pulled out of the treaty. The U.S. and NATO point the finger at Russia for violating the treaty. Russia, I think, fairly points the finger at the United States for violating the treaty first, although it does seem that Russia did develop some short-range missiles capable of carrying nuclear weapons that do slightly violate the lower boundary of the INF Treaty. Russia alleged that the U.S. Patriot missiles, the Patriot missile launchers violate the INF Treaty because they can be loaded up with cruise missiles that can support Tomahawk missiles that could carry a nuclear weapon, and then also U.S. drones violate them because you could slap a nuclear weapon to one of those things, and it's essentially a cruise missile with a range of between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. And so there were problems with the INF Treaty, but the U.S. withdrew from it. Russia now says that they're worried that the U.S. is going to move weapons that would violate that treaty into Europe. For NATO's part, the head, Jens Stoltenberg, came out and said that no, we have no plans to do that, and rejected a Russian offer for a moratorium on weapons that violate the INF Treaty, saying that NATO wouldn't be doing anything relative to a moratorium until Russia got rid of its short range or short to medium range, missiles that NATO claims can carry a nuclear warhead and violates this treaty. Of course, this is the typical negotiating position of the West, which is ignore all of our violations of everything wrong, and we're only going to focus on yours. And unless you come fully into compliance, then we won't even talk about our violations, which is, of course, almost 100% of the time an absolute non-starter for diplomacy and talks. Now, on diplomacy and talks, Russia has put out that dialogue with the United States will continue, and there have been some talks between the U.S. and Russia on the issue of diplomats. I've been covering this on the show. There's a dwindling number of diplomats staffing the embassies in each other's countries. It's so low now for the U.S. And Russia that the U.S. isn't processing any visas and doing a lot of diplomatic work. But on top of that, apparently the not ambassador, but one of the very high-ranking U.S. envoys to Russia is actually learning how to clean toilets and buff floors in case they lose any more staff. They're not going to have janitors, I guess, and stuff like that. So these are the conversations going on, and Russia says that the U.S. is only making some mild overtures, but really isn't willing to talk about any issues important enough to get this thing resolved. And so that's disappointing because there was reports a few weeks ago that there have been some breakthroughs on this issue, and it now seems like those talks have reached a setback. We do have Putin requesting an in-person meeting with Joe Biden. I definitely think this is something that should be done. You know, it would be one thing if Joe Biden was holed up in America and not traveling around the world, but U.S. and all U.S. officials have been traveling everywhere. They're not worried about COVID at all, so Biden definitely needs to go meet with Putin and try to work out something here and have some face-to-face talks. One of my guesses that if Putin wants a face-to-face meeting with Biden, he may be concerned about influences around Biden, Sullivan, Blinken, Victoria Nuland, etc., who are real hots on the Russia issue, and hoping that sitting down with Biden and doing something a little bit more face to face would allow for some actual diplomacy to get done. So I think that's kind of the status on all the diplomacy issues between the U.S. and Russia at this point. Not seeing too much progress, but it does seem at least like the Biden administration was willing to take a couple rhetorical steps back from the edge. Although if this isn't met with any real actual meaningful policy decisions behind it, and we're just behind the scenes telling the Ukrainians that they're not going to get into NATO anytime soon, while publicly sending Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to Ukraine and Georgia and telling them that they're going to come into NATO sometime soon. It probably isn't enough of a guarantee for Russia, and I think somewhat understandably so. Let's talk about U.S. surveillance flights. This from David Atz at Forbes. In a single day, the U.S. Air Force flew almost half of its best available spy planes near Russia. He's talking about the U.S. fleet of RC 135 VW River joints, and I think they're known as RJs. And the U.S. Air Force has 17 of these, and in a single day from Monday to Tuesday earlier in this week, the U.S. flew 7 of those up to the Russian border at various points along their eastern flank. The U.S. also has these planes. Of course, some of them are being serviced, but they also have them deployed other areas in the world. But the fact that we're flying so many near Russia's borders is, I'm sure, seen by Russia as very provocative and concerning, especially when we're just a couple weeks off of a Russian civilian plane having to drop 2,000 feet of altitude to avoid a NATO surveillance flight over the Black Sea. It's not just the surveillance flights. The U.S. is deploying a fleet of F-15E Strike Eagles to Romania. These are going to, take place in patrols, I think, also with Italian and Romanian warplanes. So, these are more NATO actions very close to the Russian border. And we are talking about, again, NATO existing here. Ukraine's a former member of the Russian Empire, not just a part of the Soviet Union proper, but the other countries, members of the Warsaw Pact and everything like Poland, are now home to hundreds and hundreds of very sophisticated pieces of U.S. and NATO military technology, all pointed at Russia. Lithuania says that the U.S. promised to send more weapons to Central European NATO members. I'm not sure if this deployment of the F-15 Eagles to Romania is a part of that, or if this is maybe what provoked some of Russia's concern that the U.S. was going to send the INF violating weapons somewhere to Europe. Last week, Biden spoke with Ukraine's President Zelensky over the phone. This call did happen a couple days after Putin's talk with Russia, and also a couple days after Biden spoke with other European partners. And so Gilbert Datro pointed this out, and it was something that I had observed and thought was somewhat important too, was it did seem like, Zelensky was maybe being relegated a little bit here. And this is, I think, the kind of way that sometimes the U.S. government tries to communicate to its allies where they exist in line. Now, hopefully the United States is being very blunt with Ukraine and, not just what Biden is saying publicly, but in his private conversations with Ukraine, not just going on and on with Zelensky about how we will defend your territorial sovereignty and integrity, which, Zelensky may take as Georgia did, that the country of Georgia did in 2008, misinterpreted Bush, guarantees as being more than rhetoric, thinking that it would actually help Georgia fight a war against Russia, went and invaded a territory that was held by Russian peacekeepers. And, this famously, Russia went in, invaded, and took a little bit more territory with its army proper, and the U.S. didn't do anything about it. And so I hope that the U.S. is making it very clear to the Ukrainians and Zelensky that don't think right now you have a blank checking that you're going to have military support if you decide to invade the Donbass region or the Crimea, and that the U.S. is going to back you against Russia. The U.S. needs to be making it very, very clear that that's not the case, and just, playing these little games where, I'm going to call Zelensky 2 weeks later, but, say all the same empty rhetoric we always do. On that call, Zelensky asked for more weapons from the United States, and they're talking about larger military packages being approved. Now, the U.S., as Jake Sullivan said in his presser after the Biden-Putin call, there's always a pipeline of U.S. weapons flowing to Ukraine. And just this past week, we had small arms and ammo that are a part of a $60 million security assistance package to Ukraine being delivered. And so these weapons are constantly pouring from the United States into Ukraine. But Ukraine is looking for a bigger package. Now, Ukraine may get it. They're doing some propaganda. A group of lawmakers, although nobody I really recognize as being influential, so maybe that's important, but a group of U.S. lawmakers recently traveled to Ukraine, and they're coming back and going, oh boy, let me tell you how bad it is over there. We have to send our allies more weapons. And of course, they don't mention anything about the bigger context of Ukraine and, why this is going to be seen as very provocative by Russia and likely lead to Russia giving more assistance to its forces, or the forces it bats, the separatists in the Donbass, but also the problems within the Ukrainian military itself, including the Azov battalion existing, which is a neo-Nazi faction. I mean, there's a real chance that the U.S. gives a whole bunch of weapons to the Ukrainian military, that some of those weapons are going to end up in the hands of actual neo-Nazis, not, some confused kids that, join the military and think it's funny to do a Hitler salute. No, actual people who, wear the lightning bolts on their uniforms and descendants of, the Nazis in Ukraine is what we're talking about here. Something I think the U.S., really should oppose and be very concerned with doing. Currently, Ukraine says that there would be more weapons flowing from NATO to Ukraine, but Germany is blocking that from happening. I couldn't figure out exactly what's going on, if Germany is blocking this because they don't want to provoke tensions with Russia, if they're concerned about the Nazis in the Ukrainian military, if it's just a political thing going right now because there's a political transition going on in Ukraine. Maybe Merkel felt it was inappropriate for her to do and was waiting for the new administration administration to come in. The new administration does seem relatively hawkish on this issue, and so I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming weeks or something this does get approved. However, I do think that the European powers, particularly France and Germany, are far more careful on this issue than their American counterparts, and it could actually be Germany understanding the consequences of transferring more weapons to Ukraine and isn't going through with it for that reason. In the U.S., we had the massive 2022 NDAA passed now the House and the Senate. It passed on a Senate vote of 89-10. This is, again, Dave breaks down here at antiwar.com, $740.3 billion for the Pentagon, $27.8 billion for the Energy Department's nuclear weapons program, and $9.9 billion for defense-related activities outside of the NDA's jurisdiction. And as Dave points out in this article, importantly, is it will also provide at least $75 billion of aid to Ukraine in lethal arms. So, there's all kinds of stuff in this bill, and I'm sure I'll be talking about in the weeks to come. Biden is expected to sign it, no problem. But, it includes goofy things like War on Terror Memorial, even though I hope they leave an awful lot of space at the end of the thing, because, it's not exactly over yet, and the U.S. has troops in Iraq and Syria. But, they're pretending, I think, like the war on terror is over in Washington, D.C. Biden keeps saying we're for the first time in 20 years in Congress. Building a war on terror memorial seems to kind of be a way to signal to the American people that, that they think that the war on terror is over. So just wanted to bring that up. The NDAA did pass and does include funding for Ukraine. Some other, military. Oh, wait, one more story on Ukraine. And that is the Ukrainian military leaders say their forces don't stand much of a chance against Russia without Western help. This is, the kind of important statements we were talking about on the show last week, how William Burns had recently said that Iran wasn't trying to build nuclear weapons. He's the director of the CIA, by the way, and that Russia wasn't planning or wasn't decided on invading Ukraine. And these kind of statements may sometimes seem to bring some sobriety to the country's leaders and could be important in the whole debate. And so, Ukraine's military saying that we're going to lose if you get us into a war may be something that actually bats the political leadership of Ukraine down a little bit, because it doesn't seem like the U.S. is willing to do it. We got some weapon transfers going on to the rest of Europe. The U.S. will be sending Cougar MRAPs. Those are mine-resistant armored vehicles to to Poland. They're going to give 300 to Poland in total. The UK is sending 140 troops to Poland to prevent any migrants from getting across the border. And they're also sending a group of soldiers to Lithuania for that purpose as well. The U.S. gave the Bosnian army 4 Huey-2 helicopters. And the U.S. signed a deal for 4 frigates with Greece. And that will be a $6.9 billion sale for Lockheed Martin. And then there's also included in this a $2.5 billion Lockheed Martin's also getting in on this to upgrade a different Greek warship that's also a frigate. So I think nearly $10 billion we're talking about here for Lockheed Martin for upgrading and building 5 ships for the Greek army. There was some concern initially from France because France had recently signed a deal with the Greeks for similar ships, but apparently, at least at this point, it seems that the Greeks are just going to go ahead and get ships from both countries. And so the French, I think, were very paranoid, especially after what happened with August and getting cut out of the Australian nuclear or the diesel-powered submarine deal. Felt maybe they're going to get stabbed in the back by the Americans a second time, but I don't think that's what's happening here. The Greeks are just spying a lot of warships, although I don't think this is over any territorial concerns or any concerns that Russia is going to invade. They're far more concerned about the other NATO partner, Turkey. Switzerland extradited a Russian businessman to the United States. Don't have a whole lot of details, or I couldn't look into a whole lot of the background on what's going on here. However, I just did think it was of note that, the U.S. is working on its allies to wage, multi-front issues with Russia. And I think the extradition of this businessman is a part of that. Something like we saw with Meng Wanzhou, in a Huawei executive who was arrested and held for a long time in Canada until recently. The EU is planning to sanction, or I believe actually has now sanctioned, the Russian military contractor company, the Wagner Group. In English, it's spelled Wagner. And this group has deployed military contractors to several African countries. I think they say that there were some deployed to Syria, and I believe even there was a report that they were actually Wagner Group contractors that the U.S. bombed along the Euphrates River, possibly killing hundreds of Russians in that attack. But they've also been reported to have gone to Libya, Mali, and the Central African Republic. And recently, the deployment to Mali has provoked the ire of the State Department, which the State Department put out a press release canceling, saying that that's going to add to the instability in Mali. Maybe the case that adds to the instability in Mali, but certainly no more than the 8-year plus war now the U.S. and France have waged in Mali that just doesn't typically get talked about outside of this show. There's an episode from over, I think, the summer, but maybe even actually the spring, where I talked about that war with the great retired U.S. Army Major Danny Sherjan. The European Parliament, this is the last big story on Russia I want to talk about, and it's kind of funny, but also just gross in the way all this works. The EU Parliament awarded a prize to the jailed Russian opposition. I get they always call him leader. I'm not sure how much he is a leader of actual Russian opposition, but he is the Western bat Russian opposition leader, and that's Alexei Navalny, and they gave him a award for Prize of Freedom of Thought. And the reason I get such a kick out of this is because Alexei Navalny has advocated murdering, called Russia's Muslim population cockroaches, and suggested shooting them, and actually had his prisoner of conscience status revoked from the Amnesty International because of his comments. And so the EU and the West find this guy to be an absolute darling, and it's one of these things where there's no understanding of the world from the Western perspective outside of what gets reported in the press. And so when we're arming the resistance to Assad in Syria, nobody realizes it until it's too late that that's Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And in Ukraine, nobody's realized yet, I'm guessing they eventually will, that when we're backing the Ukrainian government, and when we bet the side in the coup, we were backing the side of the neo-Nazis, the Andrei Perubi types of the Ukrainians. And in this case, again, we're backing somebody who's a bigot. And, there's no understanding of that, because in the Western narrative, it's just Russia bad, Assad bad, and everybody else good. And nobody looks at it any deeper, which is really unfortunate. All right. Couple stories here that are more about Russia and China before we talk about China. The U.S. Space Force held war games this week to test its satellite network and what would happen if it came under attack from a Russian or Chinese attack. It seemed to be their main concerns. Now, I'm not sure that there's anything noteworthy in these war games yet, but what they come up with in these war games is all kinds of needs and potential threats from Russia or China. We got to spend billions of dollars on all these systems to defend our satellites because horrific things could happen should Russia and China launch a space war or something like that. Now, the unfortunate thing is what the U.S. should be really focused on here is diplomacy and working out, probably global deals, but certainly at least trilateral deals with Russia and China, not to put, defensive weapons in space. And I understand this gets blurry when we're talking about like imaging satellites and everything like that, but there are probably ways to work out deals to at least not militarize space too much, or even developing anti-satellite weapons here on Earth. Let's see. Next, the Kremlin and Putin and Xi held talks about aggressive NATO rhetoric. I believe these talks only happened on the phone, and I believe the Chinese president Xi has not traveled anywhere since the coronavirus pandemic happened to meet with any world leaders. And so, very interesting how at least he seems to be backing the policy that he's pushing for his people, whereas the U.S. leadership is flying and traveling all over the world, constantly visiting everywhere for really no other reason other than photo ops. But these talks are important, and Ray McGovern breaks it down in a great article today at antiwar.com titled Xi to Putin, Our Relationship Exceeds an Alliance. Whether Russia and China have a formal defense alliance or something short of that became largely moot today when Chinese President Xi stated that this relationship exceeds an alliance in its closeness and effectiveness. The New York Times is insisting, and is technically correct as far as we know, that the two countries do not have a formal alliance, but as tensions grow along Russia's western border and along China's Pacific frontier, prudent statesmen would conclude the exact nature of the China-Russian strategic partnership has become a distinction without much of a difference. Moreover, this was not just President Xi's blowing smoke after his virtual one-on-one with Putin Wednesday. According to the Times, the news of Xi's startling assertion regarding a China-Russian relationship came from a briefing by a top national security aide to President Putin. So this is Xi pointing out something that was assessed, from a Russian official. And, McGovern goes on his article, but, really, it says a lot of it right there is that we've really come to a point now where Russia and China are starting to solidify some kind of relationship because of the Western aggression. And, in the past, there was a consensus, and something I talked about a lot back on the Foreign Policy Focus show, that it seemed unlikely that Russia and China would develop these kind of ties because all the other security issues that these two countries have, including their own border disputes and uneasiness among, if China would maybe try to take some Russian territory. I think they have some disputes over influence, particularly in the Central Asian stands, and also significant differences over India and Pakistan. Particularly, Russia is moving ahead with selling India S-400 missiles, and, India is in a uncomfortable relationship along its border with China. I mean, the U.S. this week is trying to at least hype to India authorities, saying that China is building up along its border with India. And so, you would think that there are several issues that should draw a line between Russia and China. However, the U.S. aggression, the U.S. rhetoric against the countries is so extreme that throw away everything else, that the U.S. is seriously considering, entering into formal treaties with Taiwan and Ukraine, and saying that, yes, we will prevent Taiwan from a Chinese aggression, and yes, we will prevent Ukraine from we will allow and bat the Ukrainians to invade the Donbass region, and then we will protect them if Russia invades back. If that's what we're talking about, Russia and China are going to say, well, India, Pakistan, or other border disputes aside, we could set that aside. The real problem right now is the Americans and NATO. And I largely think that is becoming the reality that we're living in. And something that, as Ray McGovern points out, the Biden administration doesn't seem to be taking seriously or understand yet. But it's going to be a rude awakening, and then I guess this is more my analysis. Once they're awakened to it, it's going to be very ugly, because they're going to pretend like, Putin and Xi have like this secret dark thing, and that the only reason for it is because they're evil and hate democracy. And this is a poor part of Biden's democracy summit that I'll talk about in a little bit in a second here. But they're going to, I think, pretend like Biden and Xi are the ones that are getting together, and this is the need for the summit of democracy. And it's not the summit of democracy, the international world order, the US NATO aggression against Russia and China that's provoking them getting closer. They're going to pretend that we need this new Cold War because Russia and China are getting closer. So a lot to talk about on the China issue. Going to just start off here with China saying it will strike back against reckless U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. has been pouring on the sanctions against China in the past couple of weeks. We have the House passing, and I believe the Senate is expected to pass this Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And what this bill will do is essentially prevent any exports coming to the United States from Xinjiang, China, where, largely the Uyghur area of China. There's a lot of U.S. companies, including Coca-Cola, with manufacturing there, that actually push back against this legislation, but it's passing the House, and it would, be a major separation between the U.S. and China on economic ties if it moves through. We have new sanctions being announced just today. These are targeting China's Academy of Military Medicine and 11 other associated institutes. And then also it added more firms to the blacklist of Chinese firms that Americans cannot invest in. And so I don't think they have formal sanctions against these firms. I don't think they would seize these firms' assets, but they're saying that any Americans can't invest in these Chinese companies. And the U.S. and China have a lot of trade, even with Trump's trade war and everything like that. And, when you look at it, the one thing that really makes war between the U.S. and China stupid and unlikely is nuclear weapons. But then the next thing on that list is the massive amount of trade that the U.S. and China share. And, the Biden administration is really picking up and ramping up where the Trump administration had left off in its, trade war against China, and really forcing more and more decoupling between the U.S. and China. And that definitely could make it more and more likely that some kind of military conflict could break out, going back to the old Basquiat, where goods can't cross borders, armies will. Now let's talk about Biden's democracy summit a little bit. This happened on the 9th and 10th last week. And, it's about Russia and China, but I think it's really about China. And, got together with over 100 countries. And there's tons of countries on that list that really aren't democracies and are just as bad, if not worse, human rights violators of at least Russia, if not also China. But, Pakistan's one of these countries where I believe the Prime Minister Imran Khan decided not to attend the summit, but I think Pakistan did send some representation anyways. But anyways, Imran Khan, the Pakistani president, responded to this by saying that the U.S. is trying to divide the world into blocs, and that Pakistan doesn't want to get involved in those blocs, and that it wanted to be a country that could actually facilitate talks between the United States and China, which may be the case. I mean, Pakistan's biggest concern is the Kashmir region and its, potential war with also nuclear armed India. And both I guess really Pakistan's major benefactors are probably both the U.S. and China. Pakistan wants to maintain a good relationship with both the U.S. and China because of its conflict and because of the need of probably, on the U.S. side also restraining India some, because the U.S. does have some even military and strategic relationship with India, but not as much, and I know has a pretty solid and deep military ties with Pakistan. And so, Pakistan probably sees it very important that the U.S. And China are able to get along enough that they're not demanding that Pakistan choose a side between the U.S. and China, because that could, put Pakistan in a worse, like, strategic and geopolitical position with its major concern in India. So, just want to point out here that, Biden's democracy summit is actually, counterproductive to the idea that, there's going to be some kind of like more international order or less international conflict or anything like that is actually going to bring more on. I want to just mention here that more countries are committing to the U.S. diplomatic boycott of the upcoming Olympic Games in China. There's now 5 countries signed on to that. It's the United States, Australia, Britain, Canada, and Lithuania. I believe Japan has said they're not like sending any high level officials, but I don't think they've actually signed on to a diplomatic boycott. New Zealand isn't sending anybody either, but they say that's more for COVID, and that's kind of bad, by the way. Their leadership has handled COVID. I do believe that's the case. But, it's very interesting that we're all outraged about what's happening, and we're going to boycott or make a diplomatic boycott, of the Olympic Games in China, when Qatar's working conditions are absolutely horrific for the people actually building the facilities for the upcoming FIFA games. And nobody is talking about having any boycotts of the FIFA games. And in fact, I'm sure the U.S. will be sending all kinds of representations, because we have a massive army base. The Udeid base is in Qatar. And so there's no there's no reason for the United States to be having a diplomatic boycott of these games. Now, I'm not saying that China is not somewhat of a human rights violator, and there's not like bad things that happen, particularly to the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or something like that, but it's generally a repressive government. So is the Saudis. Don't think the U.S. should be involved in like making massive protests. Let the Chinese figure out the problems within their own country, and the Uyghurs do what they do, and if they could resist the oppression, good for them if they could get themselves more freedom. But it's not in the U.S. And typically, I think what ends up happening is that the U.S. will try to get involved with these groups, and it'll actually bring down more repression on them rather than less. So let's talk about Taiwan next. The Pentagon, we have Eli Ratner, who testified in front of Congress and said a couple important things. One, Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com writes, Pentagon officials sees urgent need to boost Taiwan's defenses. And Ratner is saying we got to give all kinds of additional aid and military capabilities towards Taiwan. In that committee, and this is by Michael D. Swain at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, U.S. officials signal a stunning shift in the way we interpret one China policy, rather than, acknowledging through the one China policy that Taiwan is, a part of China and all of that. Ratner says that Taiwan is a critical node within the First Island chain, integral to the regional and global economy, and a beacon of democratic values. And so the way that Ratner is making it sound by saying that critical to the region's security and critical to the defense and vital to the U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific, if the U.S. is committed to a one China policy, it seems more like the China policy is that the Taiwan government needs to rule everything, which, signals war with China, not, this strategic ambiguity to prevent war with China. So these are some pretty hawkish claims made by Ratner. And by the way, this was absolutely predicted on the show, that when Eli Ratner was put in an important position in the Pentagon, I think he's like deputy secretary for the Indo-Pac policy, that this was going to be the result, that the U.S. was going to move more and more closer towards a war with China. Another thing I've been pointing out about the Biden administration's China policy, and particularly the personnel, is it seems like you actually have to be paranoid and delusional and terrified of China to work in the Biden administration. This is from Frank Kendall, who is the Air Force Secretary. He says about the A-10 Warthog that if it doesn't threaten China, then why are we doing this? We've had similar statements from the Secretary of the Navy, Carlos del Toro, and all up and down the Biden administration, that China keeps them awake at night, that they're only concerned about China, China, China. We're just working on China. We're just concerned about China. Now, look, obsession with any one thing is a stupid defense policy to begin with, right? Like, even if these people are generally right about the worldview that there's like multiple threats to America and we need to spend $1 trillion a year on our military, being solely focused on China is counterproductive at best, and is going to leave you open on multiple other fronts, right? But, I don't buy into all that, all the threats to America and everything, but, they do. And so that's obviously a stupid way to look at defense policy. Now, the other problem with it is that if you're only concerned about China, then you're going to create a threat in China, whether there's one there or not. And, like the language that they use, he's saying that if this weapon doesn't scare China, he actually says scare, then it's not worth having. I mean, what, like, how do you know if something scares China or not? Now, I understand that it could be used a little colloquially and, meant to be like, if, China is not concerned about it militarily and all that. But I think the rhetoric does really reflect an underlying delusion in the Biden administration about the enemy that China presents, and is particularly prevalent within the Department of Defense with hawks like Ratner and Kendall and Del Toro. And if something's not restrained, these people could actually end up getting the U.S. into some unnecessary situation with China, where the U.S. is put in a very uncomfortable and humiliating position to bat down, or we end up needlessly spending tens of billions of dollars on weapons to target China that absolutely never get used, or at the very worst, we end up in some kind of actual unnecessary conflict with China. As I mentioned before, the Pentagon is worried about Chinese military buildup near India. Man, this doesn't just sound like what was happening with Ukraine a couple weeks ago, which led to this, major issue. Now, it could be that China is actually having some kind of military buildup near its border with India, but, with the way things have been going with Russia, I would guess that that's not what China is doing right now. And I'm very suspicious that this may just be war propaganda. On Guam, the U.S. is also saying that we need upgraded missile defense there. These missile defense systems are extremely expensive and great only for the military-industrial complex. They don't work nearly as well as they claim they do, and so this won't provide Guam with any real protection. And also, when you're looking at, they're really only talking about defending the U.S. military bases on Guam and stuff like that. And this is just more of the buildup against China. The U.S. and Japan agreed to deepen and boost their alliance through with a tough security environment that they have to face together, was a part of the statement, and the title here at Reuters. Now, I don't think this is a major step. They didn't come out and announce any new weapon sales along with this, although it could be that they're agreeing to more war games and stuff. Right now, they had the Resolute Dragon 21 war games going on between the U.S. and Japan, I think in the Sea of Japan and in the Philippines Sea, 4,100 troops between the US and Japan taking part here, and all kinds of different, just, naval war games, aerial stuff going on. All, of course, threatening and, meant to intimidate and scare China, as Frank Kendall would say. The U.S. has also carried out some drills with the Australian Navy in the Philippine Sea. I believe this is in the same general area that the Resolute Dragon war games are going on, but I didn't read that the Australians were a part of the Resolute Dragon war game, so I'm not sure if these are separate exercises or a part of the same thing, but I'm sure in the context from China's perspective and what it means for U.S. foreign policy, carrying out war games with the Philippines, Australia, Japan in this area is seen as concerning from China. The U.S. will also sell the Australian Army a fleet of Black Hawks. They are going to be 40 UH-60M Black Hawks. And then we have a German ship, a German warship in the South China Sea for the first time in 20 years, according to Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. So, this is all the stuff that the U.S. and our partners are doing in military buildups against China. And of course, when China does anything like, say, fly 13 planes through Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which is far away from the actual Taiwanese island, and mistakenly in this Reuters article called the defense zone. That's a weird way to frame it, but anyways, a big deal gets made whenever China does anything, including, just having these 13 planes in Taiwan's ADIZ, which is nowhere near their airspace or anything like that. And it's probably a direct result of the U.S. carrying out all these war games and saying we're going to have more military sales, and Ratner's statements about how critical Taiwan is to America's security. We also have our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, not really dedicated to diplomacy here because, he's visiting or planned to visit Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand in order to ramp up, security ties with these countries to counter China. I don't think any of these countries are super interested in it, but every time Blinken or a different U.S. official mates a trip to this area, they bring a whole bunch of COVID vaccines with them. And this, I think, furthers my argument that the large part of the U.S. global vaccine, quote-unquote, donation program is actually just an anti-China program where we're using these vaccines to build ties with Indonesia and countries like that. Now, this trip was cut short. And by the way, the U.S. has donated a total of 25 million vaccines now to Indonesia, a country with like a 50+% vaccination rate. Blinken had to end his trip early and didn't get to give like a performance or a statement or anything in Thailand. He did go to Indonesia and Malaysia because somebody on Blinken's plane tested positive for COVID. And, this is one of the things that has really upset me about particularly the Biden administration's foreign policy and their COVID policy is that at home, you can't even like go to the grocery store without risking getting grandma sick with COVID and how terrible everybody is for not social distancing and wearing a mask all the time. And yet the U.S. is flying all over the world to, having unnecessary trips, having senators go to Taiwan, having Antony Blinken or Kamala Harris go to Thailand or Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. All of these things are just performance photo ops to try to, get these countries to, get their photo ops with the American leaders. And then it's good PR at home for them and everything like that. The U.S. brings some coronavirus vaccines. But the end goal is, the overall goal of the Summit of Democracy, to divide the world into two camps and to get these countries in the American camp and to pin them against China. That's the point of all this, not fighting any kind of global pandemic. And if they were serious about the pandemic, then they wouldn't be flying around the world, and they wouldn't just be giving vaccines to countries that they're trying to bribe into hating China. They would be giving vaccines to countries that have the lowest vaccination rates or, massive amounts of COVID deaths, stuff like that. A couple other stories here, generally related to the U.S. China policy around the world. The UAE says it shut down and halted construction on a factory being built by China at one of its ports. I guess the U.S. claimed and told the UAE that this facility was going to be used for some kind of military purposes, and I mean, it depends on how much it stretches it, how much truth it may be. Maybe it's a facility that's going to process some plastic products, and some of those products are going to be used on Chinese drones, or it could actually be that they're building some kind of component for a Chinese warplane or something. I don't know what's going on here, but the U.S. used its leverage against the UAE to shut down that port. But then we had this interesting statement happening now where the UAE is threatening to pull out of the $23 billion sale where they're going to buy drones and F-35s from the United States because of the security requirements that the U.S. puts on the UAE for importing the F-35s are going to be too onerous. This could be a negotiating position from the UAE. We also recently had the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett visit the UAE and also say that it was unacceptable that the UAE was moving closer in its relationship to Iran. And so there's a lot going on with the UAE, and it may not be all about this China issue, but I kind of suspect it may be about the China issue, and that the U.S. is really trying to use this F-35 sale to prevent any Chinese influence or investment in the UAE, and it may be too lucrative for the UAE. They may not, they'd rather not have the F-35s. They're not even that good planes anyways. The U.S. has imposed an arms embargo against Cambodia and sanctioned several Cambodians, alleging there's too much Chinese military influence in Cambodia now. I have to say Cambodia is not a country I know a whole lot about, but I do think it's important that, the U.S. is adding another country to its sanctions list, all in its effort, again, to divide the world into camps between the U.S. and China. And then a part of this, global thing is a country that's been heavily sanctioned by the U.S., heavily targeted by the U.S. Nicaragua has cut its diplomatic ties with Taiwan and reestablished diplomatic ties with China. And I'm guessing that this is going to, happen more and more as the U.S. demands the world be divided into camps. And as the U.S., decides for whatever reason that a country can't be in the American camp, that country is going to find the only place to go be in the Chinese camp. And it's, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy type situation for the Hots in the U.S., where they're going to warn about all this happening. And then it's going to happen. And because of the policies, the aggressive policies that they're unnecessarily enacting, and then they're going to go, oh my God, look, we got to do all this stuff because of all this aggression from China and Russia. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Hope you're enjoying it. Next week is Christmas. I will definitely have out 2 episodes for y'all next week, but it's going to be a busy week. So if I am 1 episode short, I do apologize, but hopefully there will be enough content for y'all to enjoy. I did some interviews recently. I was on Patrick McFarlane's show with the great Scott Horton talking about Yemen and Russia and Iran and all kinds of stuff. I was recently on Fortress on the Hill, so that interview should be coming out soon, and then I'll be doing an episode of Around the Empire pretty soon. So even if I don't get out 3 episodes next week of conflicts of interest, there'll be plenty of for our Kyle Anzalone to go around in general. And hope everybody's enjoying the show. Any suggestions, comments, feedback, support the show, share the show, anything you could do is really helpful. Always, open again for comments and feedbacks and everything like that. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll be back for more shows next week.